Good morning. The webinar will start in 1 minute. Good morning and welcome to today's webinar. I'm John Torres, Vice President of Communication and Public Relations at the National Cooperative Business Association, CLUSA International. And welcome to today's webinar, Power and Purpose, Cooperative Policy Roundtable. This webinar is hosted by the National Cooperative Business Association and the Cooperative Development Foundation in partnership with the neighboring Food Co-op Association, Cooperative Development Institute, New England Farmers Union, and the Association of Vermont Credit Unions. During this webinar, we will offer a condensed version of our planned Cooperative Policy Roundtable, beginning with an overview of the policies and efforts in New England to support the development of cooperatives as a tool to strengthen community health, equity, and sustainability. This webinar is scheduled for just over an hour. Before we begin, just a bit of housekeeping. Participant phone lines will be muted during this presentation to reduce background noise. There will be a chance to pose questions, just not verbally. If you have a question, please type it into the question box on the GoToWebinar control panel on your screen. Questions will be collected and answered following each presentation. As time allows, additional questions may be answered toward the end of the program. NCBA CLUSA will be recording this program and it will be archived on our website. You will receive an email containing a link to the posted recording early next week. With that said, I'll turn the webinar over to our co-host, Executive Director of the neighboring Food Co-op Association, Erbin Crowell. Erbin?
Thank you, John, and good morning, everybody. First, I just want to thank you all for joining us today. These are obviously challenging times for us, for our communities, for our co-ops, and we really appreciate your taking the time to be part of this conversation today. I'm going to try to move through my intro slides here fairly quickly. John, if you could take us to the next slide. So just a quick touch base on why we're here. This roundtable was originally organized as an in-person event as part of a series of regional gatherings organized by NCBA, CLUSA, and the Cooperative Development Foundation, with the goal of identifying public policy initiatives that would encourage and support the development of cooperatives as a powerful tool for strengthening the health, equity, and sustainability of our communities. Obviously, we canceled that in-person event, recognizing that it was our responsibility to support public health initiatives aimed at reducing the spread of COVID-19. But we also didn't want to lose the opportunity to be part of this dialogue and engage our regional community in this policy discussion. In some ways, I personally feel that this conversation is even more relevant as we consider the long-term social and economic impacts of the pandemic we're experiencing right now. And from our perspective, co-ops are more important than ever to community resilience and to recovery from this situation. Next slide, please. So before we get started, I did want to thank the co-hosts for the roundtable that represent co-ops and credit unions from across our region, including the neighboring Food Co-op Association, Cooperative Development Institute, New England Farmers Union, Credit Union League of Connecticut, Maine Credit Union League, Cooperative Credit Union Association, Valley Alliance Worker Co-ops, and the Association of Vermont Credit Unions. Next slide. We also had a number of sponsors helping us in organizing this event. I just want to quickly recognize CoBank, Cabot Creamery Co-op, Organic Valley, Cooperative Fund of New England, Real Pickles Cooperative, and the National Cooperative Bank. Next slide. So our goal here in this next section is to have our presenters give you a snapshot of their impact in the region, as well as their policy work and priorities. In addition to myself, we're planning to have Noemi Giszpenc, Executive Director for the Cooperative Development Institute, Roger Noonan, President of the New England Farmers Union, Adam Trott, Executive Director for the Valley Alliance of Worker Co-ops, and Joe Bergeron, President and CEO of the Association of Vermont Credit Unions. I also just want to remind attendees we'll have an opportunity for Q&A at the end of this session, which is being recorded. And Doug O'Brien, President and CEO of NCBA CLUSA, will also be giving a deeper background on this project and how you can have input moving forward. Next slide. So I'm just going to get us started in these dialogues and try to give you a sense of the impact of food co-ops in our region, as well as some of our policy priorities. So the Neighboring Food Co-op Association is a cooperative of co-ops. We have 29 member co-ops operating 37 grocery stores across our region. We have smaller rural co-ops, larger multi-store urban grocery stores. They reach across our communities in a very diverse way. Our co-ops are locally owned by more than 150,000 members, and last year 12,000 people joined our co-ops, demonstrating continued interest in local healthy food and a more inclusive economy. Our co-ops employ 2,300 people, 60% of which are full-time, which compares very favorably to the retail industry around us. 347 million in shared revenue. We also have 10 startup members. There's a lot of interest in our communities in starting new food co-ops, and we've had 5 new co-ops open in the last 10 years. Next slide. One back. Thank you. Underneath these statistics, there's a lot more community impact that we can talk about. Food co-ops are engines of local economies. Last year, our co-op sold 93 million in local products, averaging about 30% of their revenue. We're also tools for employee ownership. About 65% of staff are also members of the co-op that they work for. In terms of economic inclusion, the financial threshold for participation in our food co-ops is very accessible, with a member share being about $150. 65% of directors and 34% of general managers are women. And our co-ops are focused on sharing strategies for more effective initiatives on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Our food co-ops are also increasingly seen as sustainable mechanisms for food security in terms of community control of food access and empowering people on limited incomes. Next slide, please. In terms of policy priorities, we're really focused on promoting and protecting the co-op identity, addressing obstacles to growth that we see in co-op statutes, ensuring that government policies support co-ops, and always trying to work in cross-sector collaboration, so that we are working with worker co-ops, farmer co-ops, credit unions, all other co-op sectors to reinforce the cooperative difference while also increasing our impact. Next slide. So I just wanted to give a few quick examples of where we've been working in these areas. So in terms of protecting the cooperative identity, an example is that in 2011, a Uniform Limited Cooperative Association Act was introduced in Vermont that, from our perspective, undermined the basic definition of a co-op as user-owned, controlled, and benefiting, rather than benefiting outside investors or external organizations. And this would reduce the ability of co-ops and credit unions to compete in the marketplace. So we worked with allied groups to develop basic talking points, began to lobby state legislators, and then we recruited the support of the National Farmers Union and partners like the Valley Alliance Worker Co-ops to oppose the legislation, with the result that the co-op name was protected and the name of the statute was changed to a mutual benefit enterprise. Next slide, please. We've also been working to update existing cooperative statutes, and one example are the co-op statutes in Connecticut. Back in 2016, we worked with the Farmers Union to access a grant to help research obstacles to co-op development. And what we found in Connecticut was that the basic co-op statute hadn't been amended for more than 40 years. Individual members were liable for the debt of co-ops. There was a cap on member share price, which limited access to member capital. And there were some fairly obscure limitations on how co-ops could allocate patronage. So we worked with partners, including Dave Swanson at Dorsey Whitney LLP, to create proposed amendments, worked with our member co-ops to get a draft bill introduced, and then recruited the support of NCBA, CLUSA, and the Connecticut Credit Union League to lobby for passage of the amendments, with the result that the statute was signed by the governor in 2019. Next slide, please.
Erbin, this is Doug. If you could wrap in 30 seconds or a minute or so.
Gotcha. So finally, on access to government programs, we worked with NCBA, CLUSA, NCB, and the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops to ensure that Main Street Employee Ownership Act language included access to Small Business Administration benefits. We worked to include cooperatives and candidate platforms to ensure that co-ops and credit unions were part of policy dialogues. And we've been working to try to advocate for government resources actually being more accessible to co-ops and their members, particularly in marginalized communities. And finally, and most recently, working with NCBA, CLUSA to try to be part of a coordinated effort to ensure that any relief that comes out of the COVID-19 situation also supports our co-ops in recovery. And that is my summary. So with that, I'd like to pass the presentation over to Noemi Giszpenc of Cooperative Development Institute. Is Noemi with us? Noemi, are you with us? Maybe we can go to Roger Noonan and circle back to Noemi once she's able to connect. So Roger Noonan, president of the New England Farmers Union, will now share some of his thoughts. Thanks, Roger.
Good morning. Thanks, Erbin. Thanks, folks, for taking time out from your other web-based activities. The New England Farmers Union is a chapter of the National Farmers Union, and forgive me for a second while I fend off my hound. We were founded as the Farmers Educational Cooperative Union of America in 1902. Played a key role in the development of the Capper-Volstead Act and the Cooperative Marketing Act. Farmers Union founded many agricultural co-ops and credit unions, including one of the largest co-ops in the country, CHS. Next slide, please. New England Farmers Union has a pretty robust co-op policy. We oppose state law changes that would weaken the definition of cooperatives. We are urging USDA to revitalize its cooperative services. We promote cooperative education at regional colleges and universities. We defend the Capper-Volstead Act. And we also are heavily involved in cross-sector collaboration. And I think one of Erbin's slides is very indicative. As a farmer myself, when I see $93 million in sales of local products, that's really good for our local economy and our local ag economy in particular. Next slide, please. Thanks. So our National Farmers Union also has a very robust policy on cooperatives, of course, and protecting the basic legislation, enabling co-ops, the Clayton Act of 1914, Capper-Volstead, Cooperative Marketing Agreement Act of 26, Ag Marketing Act of 29, et cetera, and of course, federal tax rules related to co-ops, which of course in the last Tax Reform Act, we had some issues with. Next slide, please. We support government policies and programs that develop, protect, advance, and promote farmer cooperatives' roles in assembling, processing, selling, marketing, distributing farm commodities and services. And that's policy we put into action during the recent overhaul of federal food safety regulations relative to farm, making sure that farmer cooperatives were considered farmer enterprises and not food facilities. Next slide, please. We oppose attempts to revise cooperatives laws administratively or legislatively that would diminish or jeopardize the democratic nature of cooperatives and their unique governance structure as member-owned and controlled enterprises. Erbin spoke to that in Vermont, the Vermont case in particular. Next slide, please. I think people can read that one. At our national convention, we inserted new language, again, relative to cross-sector collaboration. National Farmers Union shall make efforts to assist in the development of cooperatives to benefit its members in rural economies. Efforts shall be made both legislatively and through active support of state organizations and other groups seeking knowledge of cooperative principles and laws. And then we also passed a special order of business on cooperatives. And that was about 3 weeks ago, which seems a very long time ago. Next slide. Adam, you're up. Thank you.
Hey, thank you so much, Roger. My name's Adam. I'm the Executive Director of the Valley Alliance of Worker Cooperatives. I'm also Director of Member Relations at Shared Capital Cooperative. It's great to be here today. John, on the next slide, we're just going to talk a little bit about the Valley Alliance. We are a co-op of co-ops. There's a little highlight list of things we do in our activities. And I want to share that since the Valley Alliance kind of formalized in 2008 and 2009, working across sector and working with legislators has been a big goal of ours. On the next slide, we'll just share a little bit of our previous legislative engagement. If you could go to that, John. Great. So the thing that we're one of the big things we have to do, I think, as associations, and especially involving worker co-ops, is to really build the language between legislators and worker co-ops. You can see we've got a few things we've tried to do over the past 10 years or so. And one of them is really try to build our issue positions and engage in what's happening legislatively. We really want to have a lot of chance to basically educate ourselves as much as we're educating legislators. We have issue positions that are cross-sector too. We talk to legislators about credit unions and how we want to protect them from, changing their identity and shifting them away and taking away the remaining privileges they have. We work across sector to have proclamations and declarations about how unique co-ops are. And then, as Erbin said, we've been working with Massachusetts and Vermont too on trying to protect co-op statutes. In 2017, we worked with a number of senators and representatives in Massachusetts to fight a rollback on 157A, employee cooperative incorporation. And another reason why it's great to work with associations that I was able to call Erbin and say, so what did you do in Vermont and Connecticut, and how can we learn from what you did? And we engaged. We use that as a set of tools to engage. We're also working with Massachusetts to get employee ownership funds that are dispersed from the state to go to cooperative associations too. We're still working on that. On the next slide, if you could, John, we're trying to, right now we feel like we've done a good amount of work over the past 10 years to say, hey, here's who we are, here's what we're doing. And we want to take that and build that into clearer goals. Here they are. So essentially, we find that there's a number of legislators, really that came out of the 2016 election. A lot of people stepped up to local and municipal and regional positions that are more sympathetic to cooperatives. So we want to act on that and build relationships with them and tell them that we're here for the long term. Tell them that, we're not looking for the Valley Alliance goals. We just want to point out are about uniting our work in our regional economic development, not necessarily looking for their funding to do so. We would love to get funding on that, but we want to do that with direction, with collaboration, and with a set of goals to root jobs, wealth, and civic activities in our communities, with a larger context of asserting the social, economic, and political advantage of cooperatives in our communities. So lastly, on our next slide, we are working in collaboration with Kate Latour, the government relations manager at NCBA CLUSA, with their federal and nationwide campaign, Co-ops for 2020, to work locally, to work in Massachusetts and Vermont, to say, hey, here's what we're trying to do. And I'll let you read the slide. I won't read that, but the important things we're trying to do is to, again, educate worker cooperators on why it's so important to have a relationship to legislators. In these unfortunate and uncertain and at times scary developments in our society, we think these relationships are even more critical. So yes, I feel like this kind of activity today is really essential to say to legislators, we're here and we're serving members. We're not relying on profit to deliver our activities. Meanwhile, we're running good businesses and paying into our community. So what we want to do is build on the assets we have as far as the contacts and legislature. We want to educate all legislators as far as our platform to say, here's what co-ops are doing for our communities. You should support this, know about it. And then we want to say, are there current programs that we can work together with in order to improve our economic development? So that's kind of where we're going with our programming. Happy to answer more questions. So thank you so much for the opportunity to update on work with cooperatives and legislation. Next up is Joe Bergeron with Vermont Credit Unions. Hi, Joe.
Joe, we might not be able to hear you. Can you check your mute button, please?
Is that working?
Yes,
Can
it
you hear
is.
me
Can you
now?
hear your voice?
Okay.
Yes.
I was trying not to say, can you hear me now? But anyway. So I did not send along a pretty set of slides that were very informative and intriguing to gaze upon like the previous presenters. But hey, those of you that have video have my lovely face to gaze upon, and you'll probably remember something about that, for better or worse, a lot more than any words I could have put on a slide. I suspect that most people on the line right now are members of a credit union. And credit unions are pretty prevalent in the marketplace here in the Northeast. So I'm not going to dwell a lot on details of credit unions, except to let you know that we have, and I'm going to reference my notes here real quick, there are about 5.4 million people in the Northeast out of the 15 million or so throughout New England. About a third of them, a little bit more than a third, are members of a credit union. It varies from one state to the next. As some of you have heard me say before, in Vermont, we have a very high penetration of about 64, 65%. Maybe that's easier to achieve because of the small size of the state. And then some states range down in the mid-30s to 40% or so. But overall, a little over a third of the population is a member of a credit union and uses a credit union for its financial needs. There are 266 of those credit unions in the region, and they range in size from, tiny kitchen drawer, one-person operations with a little to no technology other than what they use for their bookkeeping needs, to very sophisticated, full-service, very technology-oriented, large institutions that you're probably all familiar with. All the credit unions in New England together total about $70 billion in assets, and I don't know specifically throughout New England what the percent of marketplace is that we have adding all the states together. In Vermont, it's about 14% or so nationally, so that's probably a little different than New England. Nationally, it's probably 6 or 7% of the marketplace that credit unions hold. But the interesting thing is that even though credit unions have been, and in some cases have been growing rapidly, especially over the past decade or so, our percent of the marketplace really hasn't changed very much. The whole pie is getting much bigger. Credit unions and presumably other institutions are growing as a result of it or because of their actions within that pie. But as the pie gets bigger, even though we're growing, we're just maintaining our piece of the pie. most likely in the region mirroring what's going on nationally. So, we find that kind of interesting. The community banks throughout the Northeast, the locally domiciled institutions like here in Vermont and Massachusetts and the other states, probably are our closest, I don't want to use the word competitors, but are the most like us, not in structure, but in terms of their business practices and so on and so forth. And of course, they often, not all of them, but many of them, believe that credit unions are their largest competitors, but in fact, it's their much larger regional and national brethren that are their competitors, far more so than credit unions in terms of their consolidation and their loss of market share and whatnot is predominantly through acquisitions or loss of customer business to much larger banks that we all are familiar with. For credit unions, when I first started, and that was a long time ago, but credit unions, both in Washington and in our own state house here and in other state houses, were kind of second-class citizens. And we have a big focus on advocacy in state houses in Washington because credit unions, like insurance, are highly, highly regulated businesses. And so there's lots of legislation all the time. And there is a lot of regulatory oversight because we're dealing with other people's money. And so we have a big advocacy focus, as some of you have mentioned for your entities, not just in our own trade association, which is what I represent, but in individual credit unions as well. Some obviously more active in advocacy than others, and that's my job to try to get credit unions involved in advocacy and more active beyond the debits and the credits and the services that they provide. And some do some more than others. But overall, we've come a long way over the past decade or two. Credit unions used to be second-class citizens, I guess I'll say, legislatively with state houses and in Congress in terms of, when there was a financial issue that came up or a security issue or whatever else, legislators would think first of the banking sector and then have the moment of enlightenment saying, oh yeah, we should check with credit unions too. And today, it's not unusual to have that be the other way around. And I will say, and I know it's true in Vermont, and I'm guessing it's true in the other New England states as well, that most legislators in our state house are members of a credit union, and they just are very trusting of the credit union sector in terms of our relationship with them and when we go to them and say we need this service or this expansion or this change and whatnot. We, as most of you know, we all got a list of questions to address, and I'll touch on a couple of them really, really quick here. I mentioned consolidation of credit unions. And that's the same for credit unions as it is for any other sector. So the credit unions in number are getting much smaller. It wasn't too long ago when we were losing a credit union a day nationwide. Not that much anymore, but it comes and goes in waves. Still, when I started some 4 decades ago, there were 22 to 23,000 credit unions nationwide. Now we're between 5,000 and 6,000 credit unions. In Vermont, there were 72 credit unions. Now we're down to 19 credit unions. But all of those credit unions in the aggregate are much, much larger than they were decades ago, even 2 decades ago or a decade ago. And our penetration in the population is much higher, and the awareness of credit unions by consumers is at an all-time high for sure.
Joe, if you could wrap up in just about a minute, thanks.
I sure will, Doug. And so, one of the areas there was a question about, what are some growth opportunities and what are the sector policy areas for credit unions that are a concern that we could jointly work on. In this time of this, national coronavirus crisis and whatnot, credit unions are integral to people's, I won't use the word survival, but their well-being going forward. There's so many financial issues that are touching all of us, more so than the health in some cases. And working with others to pool funding and guarantees and whatnot is a big thing. One of the areas we've been working on for a decade in Congress and just haven't been able to crack the nut is getting Congress to enable credit unions to do more business lending. And had we been able to do that, then today there'd be a lot more assistance out there for small businesses that are going to have a hard time surviving in the coming months than there will be if it weren't for the fact that credit unions are limited into how much they can provide in equity for those institutions. Anyway, happy to answer questions like everybody else and share in the discussion. Thanks everybody for pulling this together, and I look forward to the subsequent discussion here.
Joe, thank you very much. This is Doug O'Brien. I'll be talking in just a few minutes, but we are lucky to have Noemi Giszpenc to join us. And Noemi, if you would unmute yourself and turn on your camera.
Oh, camera. I don't know about camera.
Okay, well then we can hear you. So I look forward to your comments.
Okay, sorry. I would put my camera on if I knew how, but thanks for bearing with me. Happy to join you, everybody. The Cooperative Development Institute has been developing co-ops in the Northeast for 25 years, since 1994. And we are a mighty and growing force in the region. But a whole lot of co-ops get developed without us. There are approximately 7,500 co-ops in the Northeast, 3,500 in New England, and the rest in New York. So hooray for the number of co-ops that there are. The types of work that CDI does, the Cooperative Development Institute, a large part of what we do is work with residents of manufactured housing communities so that they can create cooperatives and run their communities as cooperatives. And in these communities, the households on average are 60% of area median income. So preserving their homes as affordable is really crucial. We've helped about 50 new co-ops form in the past 10 years with 4,500 households, mostly in rural and suburban areas. I would sling a lot of numbers about the affordability crisis in the Northeast, but I think most people have a sense of it. But one of the policy problems that we see with affordable housing is really the expiring use of affordable housing. In this decade and in the coming decades, thousands and thousands and thousands of units that were subsidized to be built sort of are getting to the end of their restrictions and may convert to market rate if there isn't a legislative initiative to prevent that. And that would cause a lot of loss of affordable housing. So that's one of the things that we would love states and cities and even maybe and the federal government, because a lot of them are through USDA and HUD, to address. Another one of the areas that we work a lot in is preserving businesses, again, primarily in rural areas through conversion to worker ownership. And to put it in perspective, among the US states, Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont are the top 3 highest in median age. And the rural parts of those states are even older and losing population. So we see the conversion of businesses into worker co-ops as a job preservation strategy, a service preservation strategy, and also even just a community and the livelihood of the town and population strategy, because when people have a chance to buy in, they have a future for themselves in that area. So we've had some success with solar installation companies, a 5th generation insurance company, landscaping. So a lot of different businesses, as Adam was referring to earlier, can work as a worker co-op. So a third area that CDI works a lot in is in the food systems. And we got a nice overview from Erbin about food co-ops, and we certainly work with food co-ops as well, although a big push of what we're doing is focusing on new Americans and farmers of color to integrate into the economy through shared ownership, sometimes of farms, sometimes of food service businesses. And one of the big policy issues there is that farmers, like everybody else, are getting older in our region. So an expected 1.3 million acres of farmland is farmed by farmers who are over 65, who aren't necessarily farming. 92% of them are not farming along with a younger farmer. So there needs to be a lot of thought put into how is that land transfer going to go to new and beginning farmers, and not get lost to development. And where immigrants come in is that they actually bring a lot of knowledge about farming from their countries of origin, and having a way to put those skills to use is a great way to integrate them economically and socially. So those are our biggest areas of work. We also have been doing a lot with what we would call ecosystem development. So in Maine, we've been working with our partners, the Cooperative Fund of New England and the Genesis Fund, two CDFIs, Community Development Finance Institutions, to really think about how do you build an ecosystem for cooperatives. And what we mean by ecosystem is, in addition to what we do, the co-op development technical assistance, and what our CDFI partners do, finance and funding, we also, want to make sure that there's a lot of education and outreach, people know about co-ops, and that there is this supportive legislation. And then another thing is that we are working on building a cross-sector peer co-op network that can strengthen all of these different areas and support existing co-ops. So the event that we canceled, that was supposed to come up in April, is the Principle 6 conference, which was scheduled to be April 4th in Maine, a skill building and networking and advocacy conference that's been taking place for many, many years. And of course, it's called Principle 6 for cooperation among cooperatives. We are seeing a lot of benefits from the education and advocacy and the networking that's taking place through the network.
Noemi, if you could wrap in about 1 minute, thank you.
Absolutely. So, in terms of legislation, we would point to LD 1520, an act to create and sustain jobs through development of cooperatives and employee-owned businesses. This is an act that would provide supports and incentives for people to sell their farms, their businesses, their manufactured home communities to residents and community owners. And it hasn't passed yet, and it probably won't, given everything. It has a tremendous amount of support, including from the recent Republican candidate for governor in Maine, Sean Moody, who is the president of an ESOP company, Moody's Collision Centers. So that's really an example of how we can work with simpatico allies to get things done, and we hope to see it pass next year. So I will stop there. Thank you, everybody. And happy to take questions.
And we will have, we're going to have some time for questions in just a few minutes. I'm Doug O'Brien. I'm the president and CEO of NCBA CLUSA. And I'm going to go a little bit more quickly than I had planned through some of my comments, because I'm receiving some questions through the chat bar that I think are, a lot of interest around the moment we find ourselves in coronavirus. So, I'll move through some comments, but I did want to orient folks to to the work that NCBA CLUSA is up to, and the information that we're seeking from the New England cooperative community today. I want to thank the panelists. This is just the type of information that we're looking for, and you'll see in just a moment. I know the attendees. I had a chance to look through the attendee list. Most everyone there are friends of NCBA CLUSA, active leaders within the cooperative community. You know that NCBA CLUSA is the apex association for all kinds of co-ops, the types of co-ops represented so far today, as well as housing co-ops and all kinds of different types of co-ops that are part of the cooperative community here in the United States. I want to mention just quickly that the Cooperative Development Foundation, our affiliated 501c3, is integral to this work around building policy for co-ops, building more inclusive economies. Leslie Mead is the executive director and is also a senior policy advisor at NCBA CLUSA. As the executive director for CDF, she's been really doing most of the work around this power and purpose, which I'll talk about in just a moment. I do want to mention that Erbin Crowell, I want to thank the co-host, and Erbin in particular. Most of the people here know that he wears many cooperative hats. One of them these days is as the chair of NCBA CLUSA, so I so much appreciate Erbin's leadership and contributions. Joe Bergeron is also on the board for NCBA CLUSA, has spent a number of years in service, and we thank Joe for today, but for everything that he does for the cooperative community. So very quickly, NCBA CLUSA's mission is to develop, advance, and protect cooperatives. That's been our mission essentially for over 100 years. Our lines of work include advocacy, public awareness, thought leadership, and development. This work kind of around policy development really kind of strings together those 4 lines of work that we engage in at NCBA CLUSA. And beyond our domestic work, most of you probably know we've worked internationally for over 65 years, bringing the cooperative principles to empower people in developing regions across the globe. That's who NCBA CLUSA is. We started in 1916, and we look to our second 100 years. As we look to the second 100 years, the board took
Okay, it seems like we have some technical difficulties. Please stand by. We are working to get Doug back. So please hang on for just a moment. So while we're waiting for Doug to reconnect, I just want to remind everyone that there is the question portion on the right-hand side or inside the GoToWebinar panel where you can ask questions to any one of the presenters today. And we will get to those questions. Those questions are being passed on to the different presenters, and we will get to those questions at the end of the presentations. So thank you for your patience as we work through this bit of a technical glitch, but we'll be right back with you in just a moment. And just as a reminder, we are recording this webinar and it will be made available at the beginning or early part of next week. You'll be receiving an email following this presentation that will have the login information and the link to where you can access that recording. So please be on the lookout for that.
Hey, John, this
And
is
again,
Erbin. I'm looking at the next few slides here. Would you like for me to walk through those while we are trying to reconnect Doug?
Sure, I think that would be great. Thank you, Erbin.
So I'm trying to, okay. So let's see, next slide here. So just back to the purposes of these roundtables that NCBA and CDF have been organizing. You know, our goal's been to identify policies that can open up cooperative development, enable co-ops to contribute more effectively to healthy communities. So some of the key questions that we've been asking are, what are the policies needed to assure that cooperatives can survive and thrive? What are the barriers to these policy changes? And of the changes that we're discussing, which is most crucial to our being able to advance these goals? Next slide. And in terms of sort of the focus of the policies we're looking at and want feedback on, they include direct financing for cooperative development, resources for technical assistance, whether that's coming through associations, development organizations, or other support. What is the influence of regulation? How do we influence enabling legislation, particularly things like state statutes and other federal legislation that influences cooperatives, tax policies, licensing, preferences and policy allocation, procurement, and then policies that impact communities or customers directly in relation to their cooperatives. Next slide.
Erbin, can you hear me?
I can, sir. Would you like to take over?
I can, and thank you very much for doing so. I apologize for the technical difficulties, everybody. And seamless working with my chairman here. Thank you, Erbin. The other things that we're seeking from from the engagement today, and more specifically in the survey, that if we've not talked about it already, I'm going to direct in just a moment, are well, I'll mention the findings from the earlier roundtable just very quickly into a seasoned group of cooperators that are on the call today. These won't be surprises. They're cooperative education awareness, technical assistance and training, and access to capital, along with what types of barriers that policy can knock down. You know, these types of findings are probably not that surprising. What we found most interesting is that while the general categories are pretty consistent from generations past in policymaking, we have a real opportunity, in the current context that we find ourselves in. The context has been alluded to, in some of the challenges, both the chronic challenges and now as we're looking at some of the acute challenges that we face today. How do we make sure that cooperative policy really enables people to use co-ops to build a more inclusive economy? So once we have the set of policy ideas that can be impactful or transformational, we then ask the group to think about strategies to put those policies into law. So on the next slide around strategies and tactics to move co-ops forward, we ask questions on how do policymakers and thought leaders perceive cooperatives. Make sure we kind of take an honest look at both the understanding, and the biases, pro or con, that policymakers have to cooperatives. The second is who are allies of cooperatives. We start with the cooperative family, the folks that we have on the call here and others within NCBA, CLUSA and otherwise, but we really have to think beyond just the cooperative community into other allies that have common mission. And then finally, the question is what impedes success? So those are on the tactics, on the strategies. So next slide. Very soon, within the hour after the webinar today, we will be sending out a link, and the link is actually on on this slide deck too, to ask you these questions, to get the input from New England leaders on how we can not only create the policy environment, but also the tactics and the strategies so that we'd be successful and actually get them into law. And next slide. So again, want to thank the co-host here, my colleague at the Cooperative Development Foundation, certainly the neighboring food co-ops. We're going to go to questions in just a moment, but just wanted to lift those up. I wanted to do that personally. The Association of Vermont Credit Unions, Cooperative Development Institute, and New England Farmers Union. Thank you, everyone, for presenting today. Now I want to move to some questions and answers. And certainly we're receiving a number of questions relative to, coronavirus and where we find ourselves today. And I think I'll start with a couple that, and I know I'm gonna put Kate Latour, our Director of Government Relations. She's ready to answer some questions here. And I'm going to ask Kate to first talk about some of the work around the Small Business Administration. And before Kate, I hand the mic over to you. I just want to mention that we're kind of in this special moment that we're dealing with a very acute situation, but we also want to be thinking long term. And I think as leaders in the cooperative movement, we need to do both right now. So we're going to take a little bit of time here to talk about the immediate response and activity for the cooperative community on coronavirus. But then I also want us to think about, we need to plan for a policy environment after coronavirus. We need to make sure that there is a sustained effort to make sure we build that ecosystem of policy for cooperatives to be successful, which is really what this underlying effort is about. But certainly on top of mind, a lot of people's mind today is coronavirus. So Kate Latour, I'm going to ask you about what's going on with disaster assistance, and I think in particular the SBA economic disaster loans. Kate, can you jump on, please?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So things are very fluid and moving quickly on Capitol Hill related to the response. Everything we're seeing so far is that there will be an additional injection of funds into SBA. And unfortunately, SBA is remarkably unfamiliar with co-ops, primarily because their largest programs, 7A and 504, all require a personal guarantee, which has effectively barred co-ops from participating. So we are working closely with Hill staffers to make sure that we are remedying this so that co-ops can fairly access and have the same access as other businesses to disaster assistance. So even looking at the standard operating procedure that SBA has put forward, there's some pretty significant contradictions within how co-ops are treated, and then there is for no apparent reasons, certain co-ops, certain types of co-ops are also excluded. So a lot of our work right now is just really staying in touch with our allies on Capitol Hill and making sure we're expanding that eligibility and making sure that all types of co-ops are eligible. So I think that is pretty much the largest component of the federal assistance package that's moving right now related to co-ops. But I think this demonstrates the need from what we've been doing for years now with related to the Main Street Employee Ownership Act, that this is a burden, and it shouldn't have taken a time of economic disaster for SBA to really take it into deep consideration how they're treating co-ops, but it does put a very fine point on things, and so we're working closely, again, both with the Hill and with the administration on finding a remedy for that.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, thanks. Thank you. So let's, I'll just mention that we are at NCBA CLUSA. Please check out. We've created a microsite with resources. We had a coronavirus. We had a webinar last Friday. We plan to have another probably mid next week, more on that, maybe by the end of the day. And we're continuing to build a resource library there. So it's an absolute priority for us as we make sure that the co-op community is included in not only the disaster assistance, but they have the key information to work through the crisis we find ourselves in today. I'm going to ask one more question about coronavirus, and then I think we'll move to a little bit on the more kind of general topic on policy for inclusive economy. This one, and I'll just read it. It seems clear that COVID-19 is leading to an economic recession, if not a depression. That's a lot of what we're reading these days. Certainly, co-ops played a major role in the 30s depression and the recovery from the depression. Of course, this is a very different, pandemic-induced economic situation, and everything's happening fast. But I'm calling on the panel here for some quick reaction on, how do you think things are different in the co-op sectors, thinking about this crisis and how we might respond? I'll take just a few seconds to respond to that question. I think it's an excellent question. Then I'll see if any of the other panelists have any comment. I think one of the big differences is we have co-op sectors that have gone to scale. In the 1930s, it was really, I think, only agriculture that had really gone to scale. Credit unions had a great foothold, but had not yet really grown. Rural electric cooperatives hadn't even begun. We have a lot more experience. We have more literature. We know what co-ops can do and what they do well. I think so I think there's an opportunity because there's track record. At the same time, we do have a real challenge in trying to bust through not only the public awareness, but also reaching policymakers. There's a lot more noise. There's a lot more people who are better financially resourced in the co-op community to share their message. So we need to be even more strategic and deliberate about how we share the co-op message. But I do think, and maybe that's the foundation of this question, we're at a moment when people should be interested in the co-op business model, looking at more community-based solutions as we work through this pandemic. Those are just my quick thoughts. I'd invite any of the panel members to have any quick reaction to that.
This is Noemi. I'd be happy to jump in.
Yeah, please, Noemi, go ahead.
Yeah. I do think that public perception and awareness is something that we have to work on very deliberatively because, co-ops may feel to some people like, oh, something nice that we can think about, in normal times rather than like something essential that, is what we need for the future right now. And I think one of the ways we've been thinking about it at CDI is lifting up some of the great things that co-ops are doing in this crisis, whether that's like delivering food to seniors or, making sure that everyone in a community is being checked in on and has hand sanitizer. I think that we really need to lift that up, but also, highlight the differences in how co-ops react to a crisis situation relative to other businesses. I know that, after the last recession, there was a great film that the European Worker Co-op Federation put together showing this is how worker co-ops responded to the crisis. And it wasn't just keeping people on, it was also like engaging with the marketplace and shaping the marketplace to make it possible for worker-owned enterprises to develop and thrive. So, I definitely think this is a moment to cope with what's right in front of us, but really think about positioning ourselves for the long term as the future.
No, I think those are great comments, and actually, I think they apply both to the kind of the immediate crisis we find ourselves in, but it's really they apply to the longer term too. That showing in a really compelling way the impact that co-ops make, not only in a in a quantitative way, but not qualitative, telling the stories that are impactful. Other panelists, Erbin, Pat, Adam, any quick reactions or comments on there?
So this is Joe. Am I on?
Yeah, go ahead, Joe. We can hear you.
So quick reaction, a follow-up on what Noemi just said.
Joe, now we can't hear you.
Okay.
I can hear you.
Well,
I can hear you, Joe. Go ahead.
It's just you, Doug. So a quick follow-up on what Noemi was saying about, how co-ops react to a situation like this. And of course, I'm only speaking from a credit union perspective, but I think it's applicable across most, if not all, co-op sectors. And, working together to come to some kind of resolve or for a single purpose and whatnot is what co-ops do all of the time, every day. And so we're just doing more of it now in ways that we hadn't contemplated before. I can tell you that I've been talking to a lot of regulators and a lot of legislators and state officials and so on and so forth in recent days. And, they know they can rely on credit unions as cooperatives and other cooperatives too for assistance and cooperation and whatnot. But I'm not sure at this point in time, with all of the problems that are getting thrown on everybody's plate every hour, that they care that we are a cooperative or for-profit or whatever else. It's what we do and how we do it that they are reacting to. And I think where the recognition that, oh yeah, that was done by a cooperative, where that gets amplified and comes through best is afterwards, somewhere down the road where we can point to, as Noemi was pointing out, these were our actions and how we did it differently. And we continue to operate this way, even though this crisis is behind us now. We continue to do the same stuff. And I think, people who are members of a credit union or members of a food co-op or whatever it happens to be, right now, they're cognizant of the fact that they're a member of one of those cooperatives and that it helps them, that they can rely on it when they need it in a time of crisis and whatnot. But I'm not sure they think that because it's a cooperative. They think that because of the way they were treated or helped before or during this crisis. And so I think that what we do here, like Noemi said, is something we play up a little bit down the road after this crisis is behind us.
This is Erbin. I agree with those comments. I do think that this is an area where we need to get much better at honing in on what is distinct about cooperatives and credit unions in their structure and reduce the confusion between co-ops and other approaches. Because while I agree with you, Joe, I think it's the underlying structure as being member-owned, member-governed, rooted in the community that enables cooperatives to do those things that matter at times like this. And certainly our food co-ops are at the center of this crisis right now, where people are worried about health. They are challenged in terms of how they build community at a time when you're trying to deal with social distancing. They're watching small businesses around them, really suffer from the dramatic reductions in sales and wondering how they're going to contribute to rebuilding from that. And certainly co-ops will play a key role in that. I think whatever the sector we're talking about, we've got to figure out a way to communicate the value added of cooperation more effectively, right? Because if people, for example, in the food co-op sector, if people are excited about the level to which food co-ops are buying and selling products from local producers, they need to understand that that is an increase in cost for the business, right? It's a value added that the consumer can help us build, but it's not apples to apples to compare local food distribution systems with the type of international systems we're seeing that are really at the heart of some of these challenges, right? When you look at the paid medical leave that food co-ops have compared to the retailers that we compete with, how can we communicate to consumers that is part of the value added when you shop in a cooperative, or you park your money at a credit union, or you choose products from a farmer cooperative? Those are that community resilience is all part of the value added that you're purchasing when you are participating in the cooperative economy.
Yeah, I don't think we're saying anything different, Erbin. I think I'm in agreement with you. The bottom line for me is that, our cooperative structure and the cooperation is exhibited by our actions at a time like this. And in a time of urgency and emergency, people are looking for those actions, and they will remember, where they got that assistance or how they got it and the basis for it, because it was a cooperative, after the urgency is behind them.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
This is Roger, and as a practitioner, I'm actually a board member of a co-op. I'm a farmer in a farmer co-op. I would just, Erbin said a word in his last remarks, it's resiliency, and I think that's really the key. And at times like this, it's the resiliency of the co-op structure, of that member-owned, democratically controlled, concern for the community. Those 7 principles that really ring true right now, and I think they ring true with our members, with those in the broader community around us. And I don't think there's any harm in highlighting those principles through this crisis, because the world's changing. After this crisis is over, we're in a different world, and everything we thought we knew prior to COVID is going to be different. And I think the co-op structure as a way moving forward to improve resiliency in our economy and our society is a perfect model to lead with. So, thanks.
We haven't lost you, have we, Doug? John, can you see other questions there? Do you want to try to give us a couple other questions to field?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the questions came in and says, what is our move on the national level, given that our economy is being completely restructured before our eyes? Do we have a list of demands or recommendations? Is there a rapid response that is activating this network? We need to think big, an example being the rural electrification.
Well, this would be a great time to have Doug.
And Doug just got back on. Can you hear me?
There he is.
Yeah,
Thank you, Doug.
I want to again apologize to everybody. And I had an amazing, eloquent response to that question that I just presented to myself. And I'll do it.
Boy, that's frustrating. I would really love to hear what Doug's
So I won't be
responses.
nearly as eloquent, but I can talk a little bit about what NCBA CLUSA has been doing. And I think it really does come back to how the federal government treats cooperatives and understanding that the structure itself is what makes it strong, and that federal programs need to not necessarily treat them any special, but recognizing that and provide them with fair access. So, a lot of our work has been around making sure that whatever agency is getting federal assistance to be made available for small businesses and individuals for that matter, that co-ops should be eligible. And then I know, we're also trying to lift up a lot of the great work that some of our other organizations, some of our members are working on as well. For example, the credit union, CUNA has a pretty extensive list that they've shared and kind of touches on what Joe mentioned, including expanding the eligibility for credit unions to make loans to small businesses without that cap. So I think really one of the, again, just the major component is going to be making sure that co-ops aren't left out of this federal assistance. So I apologize that I'm sure I was not anywhere near as eloquent as Doug would have been, but just a brief synopsis of how we're making sure that co-ops are included in this kind of larger conversation.
No, that's awesome, Kate. I think the thing that I would add to that is a lot of the work of NCBA CLUSA over the past few years has been focused around the role of cooperatives in building a more inclusive economy. And a lot of the sort of on the ground work, such as these roundtables, such as the lobbying that Kate's been working on, such as some of the collaboration with community development organizations around making the case for co-ops, such as you may recall the report, the ABCs of Cooperative Impact. You know, for a lot of years on the national level, we have not made a strong, compelling case for the cooperative difference and built up the information to back up that claim. And I think a lot of the work over the past couple of years that NCBA has taken on is collecting the data, working with partners, doing these types of dialogues to build up the argument so that when we are ready to present policy recommendations, when we're ready to engage with policymakers, we've got the information to back up those proposals. Doug, are you back on?
I am back, and since we're almost at time, I won't fall off again, I hope. Erbin, I think what I heard of Erbin's comment at the end is right to the point of what I was trying to make before. Not only the work we've been doing the last 2 or 3 years, but in particular the regional roundtables that we've held, including this one. We have a lot better validation and ideas from the leaders in the field, and we need to think about how to accelerate some of these policy conversations. We reestablished the Cooperative Business Caucus in this past year. We have 25 bipartisan leaders in Congress that we now have a channel to, and we've been talking to over the last couple weeks. We've worked with presidential campaigns in this last year and had some good success in getting cooperative policy in front, and in fact, in some of those platforms. Obviously, this is going to be a great time of flux in a moment for cooperatives to stand up and show how they can solve some major challenges that we have here. So I think that's a great point. With that, and we're almost at time, I want to thank the co-host again. I want to thank the presenters, and I want to thank the sponsors for this webinar. And I want to mostly thank the people who agreed to participate and were here today in what is a lot of conflicting priorities at the moment. And it's really important. We're sending out a survey in the next hour or so, and we need your input. Please do fill out that survey, and by next Friday, so a week from now, we'll have that deadline in the email, and we will be able to take your input as we craft this policy paper that will help inform the cooperative community in its advocacy agenda over the next year or two. So everyone, please, thank you for being with us today, and please be safe, be healthy, take care of yourself, take care of your loved ones, and thank you for what you do, not only for your communities, but for the cooperative movement as a whole. Everyone, have a great day. Hey.